Good evening, everybody. This is lesson 6 of Lambda School's mini bootcamp series. My name's Deandra Ryan Moss, and I am your instructor. So let me tell you a little bit about this mini bootcamp and about Lambda School in case you're new with us tonight. So Lambda School is a computer science and web development immersive. So Lambda School is a 6-month program to learn how to program. What we do is we take someone who's at a very basic introduction level, the kind of place you would be after attending this mini bootcamp, and we get you to the point where you are ready to be hired as a software developer. So as I mentioned, we do that over the course of 6 months in a full-time program, or we have an option to do that part-time over the course of a year. And we cover a lot of different topics, front-end development, back-end development. We build a web app together, and then we cover some computer science topics as well. So it is a really broad, expansive curriculum where you learn a lot of cool skills that you will use on the job. One thing that I know I've mentioned a few times about Lambda School that makes it really special is our tuition model. So let me break down how that works for you guys in a little bit more detail. So with a normal school, you pay tuition up front and then you attend. And we do have that option for anyone who's interested. But we also have a deferred option, which means that you pay 0 upfront. So you don't have to pay anything initially to attend Lambda School. You do have to pay us once you get a full-time job in the field making over 50K. So if you don't get that job, we do not get paid. And the reason we do that, well, there are really 2 reasons we do that. The first is that a lot of us, whether the founders or instructors like myself, all attended boot camps when we were getting into computer programming. And I know for me personally, it was a little frightening to go in and pay a bunch of money up front and to not really be sure if it would pan out or not. In my case, it did pan out. But it's great that we have this option because if you don't have the money or if you're a little uncertain, you can still go to Lambda School and you don't have to pay us back until you get that job. The other reason we're able to do that is because we're extremely confident in our curriculum and our placement team. So we feel confident that we're going to get you to the point where we'll get a return on our investment, which means that you get a job. So that's Lambda School. This is our mini boot camp. It's totally free. It's available to the public. It's our way of getting you guys ready for the main curriculum. Or if you're just interested in learning a few basics, you're of course welcome. So we've been going over front-end development topics. Last week, we learned all about CSS, HTML, and a little bit of JavaScript. And this week is nothing but JavaScript. So if you guys are brand new to this and you don't have any JavaScript experience, I would definitely recommend going back over some of the old videos or maybe just waiting for next month. But for all of you who have been with us, let's go ahead and jump in on our topic for tonight. So we went over last night Booleans, control flow, loops. So we started to see a few ways that JavaScript can be dynamic. We saw that we don't necessarily just read the code from top to bottom. Sometimes we skip things depending on certain conditions. Sometimes we might read the same line of code over and over again with a few things changed, such as in loops. Today we're going to move away from control flow and talk instead about arrays. Arrays are a slightly more advanced type in JavaScript. They're actually a data structure, which means that they're a way of storing not one, but multiple pieces of data. So let's go ahead and dive in on that. I'm going to share my screen so I can go ahead and code for you guys, and we can explore what arrays are, how we build them, and how we use them. All right, so to introduce you to the idea of arrays and data structures, I want to give you a little example of a type of coding problem where you might be having multiple pieces of data that are all related. So if I were trying to build some sort of app or script that deals with an appointment book, I would want a way of keeping track of all my appointments. So if I'm even just trying to keep track of, let's say, tomorrow's appointments, I would have to, based on what we know so far, I would have to create a new variable for every single appointment. So I could do appointment 1, and maybe that's who I have an appointment with. Appointment 2. Etc. So this is a really simple example because chances are I have more than 3 appointments, but even just typing out 3, this was starting to get extremely tedious. As we saw yesterday with the loop example, whenever you start to type out these lines of code that seem very similar and it's just you're kind of writing almost the same thing over and over again, that is a red flag. That is a sign that you are not using JavaScript to its full capacity. We always want to follow this principle of don't repeat yourself or writing dry code. So I'll just put that in the comment at the top of the screen. So dry coding means don't repeat yourself. So we're doing some serious repeating here. And that means that we want to use something else, something more sophisticated. And in this case, what we would want is an array. An array is a way of keeping track of all of these pieces of data within one variable. So here's our little example of what not to do. Now let's go down here and see how we could use an array in this. So I'll go ahead and call my array appointments. And by convention, arrays are normally named some sort of plural word because they contain multiple data points. And then I use these hard brackets for arrays, and then I can put every single piece of data in here separated by commas. So let me fill this in, and then I will break down in detail how the syntax works. All right, so now I have an appointment array. So this is a much better way of storing multiple pieces of data. So let's look at the syntax. Our variable declaration is the same as what we're used to. We'll just use our const keyword. We name the array appointments, and then use the single equals to denote what we're going to store in appointments. And as a little reminder from last night, single equals in JavaScript means variable assignment. Double and triple equals means equality. They're compared, that we use those for comparison. But anyways, so because we're assigning a variable, we just use a single equal sign. And then we can go ahead and use these brackets to indicate we have an array. So within our array, I went ahead and put in all 3 data points and separated them by commas. So this is a little different from what we're used to seeing because we have 3 strings stored within this array, but they're somehow all stored into just one single variable. So this is a great example because we're utilizing order. So one situation where you always want to use an array is when you have some sort of collection of ordered items. So in this case, we're looking at my appointment book for tomorrow. So we know that Joe, who's in the first slot, is first, Sally is second, Jim is third, etc. And we could fill this array with hundreds of items if we wanted, or we could keep it to 3 or 1 or 2, or even make it empty. It's totally valid to create just an empty array to start, and we can put things in it later. But it's also valid to go ahead and initialize it with data inside of it. So here's an example of the appointments array. Another slightly different example would be with unordered data. So instead of doing appointments, if I just wanted to create an array that contained a list of all my clients, then I could do something very similar. And chances are, hopefully, I have more than 3 clients in this mystery business that I run on the side that I'm creating an app for here. So now I have a clients array. So this one's a little different in that it's not ordered, right? It's just a collection of related items, but there's no specific order. It's not like Joe was a client first or Sally was a client second. It's not alphabetized or anything, but it's still a way of clumping like items. So in summary, we want to use arrays when we have some sort of collection of like items. They totally work for ordered items, and in fact can be really powerful for keeping track of order when you have ordered data points. But if you just have a collection of unordered like items, such as this example of all of my clients, arrays work perfectly fine for those too. So one other thing I wanted to show you with arrays is that in these examples, we have arrays full of all strings, but that's not necessarily the case. So for example, if we're trying to keep track of something with numbers. So maybe I'm trying to keep track of how many steps I walk in a day. So in this case, I'll have steps, and maybe for my entire week. So perhaps I did 78 yesterday, 36 today. Tomorrow, maybe I'll walk a lot, etc. Wow, 36 steps. That's really sad. Let's add some zeros here. I walk around more than that. And then, I could keep putting in data points for days in the week. So now we have an array containing numbers, and that's totally valid. And arrays can really contain anything. They can contain strings, numbers, booleans, more complicated things. They can contain arrays. That's right. You can have arrays within arrays if you want. And finally, you can also have mixed type arrays. So if, for example, I had this array called user, and maybe I want my name, maybe I want the city I live in, and then, my hometown, etc. And then let's say we also wanted my age, which is not a string, it's a number. That's totally valid as well. So we have these 3 different items that are all strings, but then we have something in here that is a number. So I will say that in this case, an array is not the data structure I would want to use. I would probably want to use something called an object that we'll learn about tomorrow. So we'll talk more about that. And in general, as a rule of thumb, usually you do end up with arrays that have like items, an array of all numbers or all strings. In most cases, that's going to be what you want to do. But I did want to let you know that you are allowed to have mixed types in an array, and there are totally cases when that's the right move. But I'll go ahead and get rid of this one. And that brings me to this idea of data structure. So I know I've thrown out the word data structure a couple times without really defining it. So I want to take a moment to discuss what is a data structure and why do we like data structures. So the most general definition is that a data structure is some sort of way of storing multiple pieces of related variables within one variable. So we have multiple objects within one variable. So we have these different strings, which are all kind of their own thing, but they're related, they're connected. So we collect them in an array and store them into one single variable. So you could just think of them in the most general sense as being collections of JavaScript items. Now let me get to this question of why do we like arrays? Well, already you might see in comparison to that example where I created 3 different lines of code for this one thing, it's more sleek, right? We're able to more easily write out what we need. But more importantly than that, we're able to organize what we need in a more useful way. So in this case, it's very clear that these are all related. Whereas before, when I had just said appointment 1, appointment 2, to a user, to a human, it's clear that these things are related, but to the computer, there's no way of connecting these things. Whereas from the computer's perspective down here, it's pretty clear that these are all connected. And what's more is arrays have different properties and methods built in that allow us to do cool things with our items. So we can iterate through them. We can sometimes move around their order. We can access different items. We can add and get rid of items easily. And I'll break down all of that later. So essentially, it's just always a good idea to use an array when you have some sort of collection of like items. You never want to individually write out variables for each item when you have some sort of list or collection like this. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the cool things we can do with arrays so that I can fully convince you that they are worth your time to learn. So the first thing we want to do is access. So I will use our appointments array. So if I just go ahead and type out the appointments variable, as we know, replit will take the very last line of code here, and whatever it resolves to will appear over here in green. So when I run this, appointments goes ahead and appears over here. So we can see, okay, this is all the stuff in appointments. But say that appointments was really, really long. There were thousands of items in it. It'd be pretty unruly to log out the entire thing. Or say we knew specifically that we wanted to just look at the first item here. If I'm starting my day, I'm really only interested in who I have an appointment with first. So that's when we would use indexing. So we can grab the first item of appointments using appointments at 0. So let's talk about a couple things here. The first is syntax. It's pretty easy to remember that you use the hard brackets because they're the same type of brackets that we use when we declare arrays. So arrays are always these square brackets. So we take the array name followed by a pair of these square brackets, and then we put the index inside the middle. And that brings me to my second point, which is that we start indexing at 0. So this is always a sticking point for new programmers. So if you get a little confused by this, don't worry about it. You'll get used to it. So that means that Joe is the 0th item in our list, Sally is the first, and Jim is the second. If I want the first item, I always do index at 0. If I want the next item, I do index at 1, etc., 2. And if I ever try to grab something at an index that doesn't exist, we get our good friend undefined. So if we wanted to, for some reason, leave this blank, say I had an empty appointment slot, we could put null in here. So this is a good example of that distinction between null and undefined that I talked a little bit about yesterday. So in this case, maybe null indicates that my second appointment slot of the day is empty. So I have, a free hour. So if I go ahead and do appointments at 1, I get null, which tells me, okay, there's no appointment here. But if I did appointments at 5, I get undefined, which says, okay, nothing's even been put into the array at slot number 5. So that's a little example of the difference between null and undefined, just as a side note. So let's get rid of that. So using indexing, we can grab whichever item we want. And this really ties into this idea of ordered lists. So especially when arrays are ordered, this indexing piece becomes really useful. So using the same syntax, we can, of course, figure out what's at a certain place in the array. We can also use it to redefine different items in the array. So if I realized, oh no, I accidentally spelled Sally's name wrong, I could go ahead and fix that on a different line of code. If instead it's Stevens with a PH, I can go ahead and assign it, and then, if I run this, I now see that appointments has been updated. And based on line 7, Sally's name has been changed. So this is, once again, just that same syntax we're kind of used to seeing. We don't actually have to declare a variable here, so you wouldn't use the const keyword because appointments already exists. We're really just updating one specific slot in here. So we're saying, take this value, in this case, Sally Stevens with a PH, and assign it into appointments at slot number 1, which of course, because of 0 indexing, is actually our second place in the array. So we can use this bracket notation to both grab items at a specific spot, to reassign them, or even to assign something that hasn't been assigned yet. So if I wanted to add my 4th appointment, which is at index 3, and let's do Amy Hansen there. Then when I go ahead and output the value of appointments, I can see that she has been added on the end. So we can use this syntax to grab a specific item in an array, update a specific item, or to even add items onto the end. So that is the indexing system with arrays. And that really is like the bread and butter of arrays. You need to understand that. And really the most difficult piece is just remembering that 0 comes first. And as I said, you will forget this. You will have moments where you're like, what is going on? Why is logic broken? And it just turns out that you're trying to use 1 to grab the first item when actually you want 0. So let's talk a little bit about one of the properties on arrays. So as a reminder, on our first day of JavaScript, which was last Thursday, we talked a little bit about this idea of properties. So I know we saw with strings that, let me just do a little string example. Same. So if I wanted to know how many characters are in the string name, I would do name.length, and that gives us 7. So for properties, we always use this dot notation followed by some sort of keyword. So length is a property that is built into all strings. So all strings, any string that you made would have a dot length property, which tells you how many characters it has in it. Even empty strings have a dot length property, but of course they are set to 0. So not everything has a dot length property. For example, if we did a number instead and tried number.length, we get undefined because numbers do not have a length property. But it turns out that arrays do, which makes a lot of sense because they contain multiple pieces of data. So if I do appointments.length, as you might expect, we get 3. So dot length is intuitive. You just count 1, 2, 3. There are 3 items. But of course, because of 0 indexing, appointments at index 3 is undefined. So another common point of confusion when you're just getting used to these is that the last item will always be length minus 1. But if you do dot length, it's going to give you the intuitive number you'd expect. It'll give you the same number as if you just counted the items in the array on your hands. So that is the dot length property. And that is really the only property I want to cover on arrays because most of what's really interesting about arrays are the methods. So this is another little reminder because I know I mentioned methods last Thursday, but methods are built-in functions. So they're really similar to properties, except that while a property is just a single value, a method is actually a function. So it's actually some sort of behavior that you can execute on a type. And and different types of variables in JavaScript have different built-in methods. So we saw, for example, console.log is a method. So on the console object, there is a .log method, and it takes in one parameter, and it logs whatever you put into it. So that is a method log, which is on the object console. So all arrays have a lot of really useful methods. The first one I want to show you is push. So I showed you one way of adding something to the list. So if I wanted to add my 4th appointments, I could do appointment at index 3, and then go ahead and put in my next appointment. So this is useful if you know how many are in here, but let's say that you weren't sure how many appointments you had. Well, there's an even simpler way to add something to the end, and that is the method push. So what push does is it takes in one argument and it adds it to the end of the array. So if I look at appointments now, I can see that Amy has been added on the end. And it turns out that no matter how many I add here, I don't know why I'm so obsessed with the name Jim, but if I add someone on the end here, this push still works. It still adds Amy onto the end. And I could keep indefinitely adding people here, and push would always add Amy to the end. Whereas if we explicitly stated what index to put her on, then we might have her overwriting this last Jim that I put on here. So push is a really great method. It's really the preferred way of adding something to the end of your array. So another method I want to show you is something that's kind of the opposite of push. It's called pop. And as you might imagine, pop removes an item from the end. So if we go ahead and run this and then look at what's in appointments, we see that, well, it doesn't look very interesting because Amy has actually been added and then removed. But let me go ahead and comment out this line because I think it'll be a little more clear what pop is doing. So now we see that we have popped off Jim Billings. So we're only left with Joe and Sally. Another interesting thing about pop, because we're always asking ourselves with with functions, what is the input, what is the output, what is the argument, what is the return value? So in the case of push up here, we take in one parameter. So in this case, our argument is Amy Hansen. a string. So we take in one argument and we go ahead and stick it on the end of the array. And then there's no output. But if we do pop instead, it's kind of the opposite, where we don't need any input, we don't need any arguments. It's just saying, hey, pop out the last item. And what's cool about pop is there actually is a return value. So remember, a really good way to find out if a method or a function has a return value is use replet and let that function call be the very last line of code. So the return value will always be the thing that appears in green on the screen. And it turns out that not only does pop remove the last item of the array, it actually returns it to you as well. So that's a cool little feature of pop. So that's push and pop, two of the most easy ways to manipulate what's on the array. And those, of course, affect the last item on the array. They always interact with just the last item. Now I want to introduce you to shift and unshift. They're kind of like push and pop's evil twins. So while while push and pop deal with the last item on the array, shift and unshift deal with the first item. So let me start with shift. Shift is the method that removes the first item. So it's very similar to pop. It doesn't take in any parameters. There's no arguments you need to put in. And then it takes the first item on the array, it goes ahead and shifts it off, and then returns it. So let's go ahead and throw our appointments variable down here so we can see what that resolves to. So look, appointments now has the first item removed. So that's what shift does. Unshift is kind of like the opposite of push. So with unshift, we can add something on the front. So I'll go ahead and add Amy on the beginning of our list. So if we do that, she's now appeared on the beginning. So one little note about the difference between push and pop and shift and unshift, and one of the reasons that I think that shift and unshift are a bit more sophisticated to deal with. So when we use push and pop, our index is not affected. So when we push Amy onto the end, Joe is still at index 0, Sally is still at index 1, Jim is still at index 2, but we've added another one. But everyone else is exactly where they were in the first place. Same thing happens when we pop. We might remove Jim off the end, but Joe and Sally are still in the exact same index that they originally were. But that is not what happens with shift and unshift. So now all of a sudden, whereas Joe was before at index 0, he's now at index 1. Sally is at index 2, etc. So a couple takeaways. First is just a good little memory clue for remembering which is which. So in the case of shift and unshift, it's actually the indices that are being shifted over. So that's a good way to remember that shift and unshift are the ones that affect the first item in the array. The other takeaway is that as a developer, you really shouldn't get too attached to what item is in which spot. And in fact, you can think about that practically with something like an appointments array, because you always want the thing at index 0 to be your first appointment. So for example, if I were writing some sort of app to keep track of appointments, whenever I had met with Joe and that appointment was over, I would probably want to do appointments.shift. And then Sally becomes the appointment at spot 0 because she's next. So just don't get too attached to thinking that one item should be in one spot in an array, because as code goes on and manipulates, sometimes arrays get changed. So it's really important to be thinking about these things as actually ordered lists, and the first item might change. So the final thing I want to mention about push, pop, shift, unshift is that learning about them might beg this question of, well, what if I want to remove something from the middle of the array or add something to the middle of the array? It is possible to do that, and it's not too complicated, but it's not as simple as just doing one method. You couldn't, for example, do appointments.pop at 5, and all of a sudden it'll pop whatever's at index 5. That's not how pop works. So as far as built-in methods, we only have tools to deal directly with the last and the first item in the array. As far as actually adding or removing things from the middle, once again, not too complicated, but not something we're going to cover in this course. So if you're really interested in it, you can go ahead and research it on your own this evening. Okay, so those are a couple really important methods, and they're actually all the methods that I want to cover tonight. But before I move on, I want to say a little bit about methods and about documentation, which is that there are tons of built-in awesome tools in JavaScript. And one of the hardest things about being a new developer is that you almost always end up doing things kind of the long way by mere virtue of the fact that it's impossible for you to have everything memorized. So I do want to say, don't worry about that. We don't expect you to memorize all these methods. But at the same time, you shouldn't just ignore them. So I'm going to do a little Google search here. And I'm going to say array methods JavaScript. And one of the very first things that pops up is W3 Schools, which is a great reference. MDN, also a really great reference. This is the one I'm going to pull up. So over here, we have a list under methods on this sidebar here. We have a list of every single method on here. So I know it says array.prototype.pop. Don't worry about this prototype thing. We will cover it in a later lesson. But all this is saying is that you could do any of these things you could do on an array. You could do appointments.join, appointments.find, appointments.slice, appointments.sort. So there are tons of these things. This is a lot. And no, you don't have to memorize it. But as you keep working with these, especially once you get into the main curriculum, I would recommend pulling this up every once in a while and poking through it, and maybe just trying to learn a new array method, every other day or once a week. And in that way, you'll be really familiar with what actually is built into JavaScript and all these cool ways that you can use arrays. And the final takeaway of this is whenever you have a question, Google it, even with these things that you've seen tonight. If you're feeling good about it right now, and then the homework comes along tonight and you're like, oh gosh, I can't even remember what the difference between pop and push is. They're right here, and everything is documented with examples. So this is available to you online. And yes, we have TAs available to help you in the chat channel, and I'm a really big believer in utilizing those. But as a little challenge to you, the first time you get stuck on the homework tonight, before you go to the channel, just try Googling it, because it's a really important skill to learn as a programmer. So that is a little bit on arrays. Let me bring this back together now with something that we learned last night, which is looping. So let me do a little bit of a reminder for you guys of how for loops work. So I will go ahead and write out a for loop for you, and then I will break down what the syntax is, just as a little reminder, because I know these things can get hairy when you're just using them for the first time. So right here, I have written out a loop that will log the number 0 through 4. So let me run it. It looks like it works. So as a reminder, you always use the keyword for a for loop. And then in parentheses, you have these 3 different statements. You want to declare and initiate a variable. Usually you'll use I, some sort of simple thing to keep track of your index. So I initiated this at 0, which is why my count starts at 0. You want to then, as your kind of second statement, let the computer know how long the loop should continue. So I've said, as long as my index is less than 5, we want to continue. So if I had done less than or equal to 5, now we see that the loop goes all the way up to 5. And as I mentioned last night, it's important to keep track of how these 2 items relate, because that's how you end up with an infinite loop. If you accidentally switch this, then if we did like something like this, that's when we get an infinite loop. So always keep an eye on that when you're writing loops. And then this final statement here is almost always going to be I++ or I-, and it just tells us to increment our index by 1 every time we loop. So here we have a little for loop. And for loops and arrays go hand in hand. So let me go ahead and get rid of this for a second. So if I had, once again, my appointments array, And I'm going to be really lazy here and not make up more fake names. So if I wanted to log everything inside of my appointment array, I could, of course, write out 3 statements like console log appointments at 0, console.log appointments at 1, and then console log. And this would totally work. I could run it and it would log all 3 clients. But as mentioned, this is not dry. We're repeating ourselves. And this is a perfect opportunity for a loop. A good way to know that it's time to write a loop is when you are writing the same line of code multiple times and the only thing that is changing is a number. That is almost always going to be a sure sign that a loop would be a better way to do it. So I will comment this out, this kind of what not to do, and then let's write a loop instead. So we do want to start at 0 because of 0 indexing. And in this case, we want to go up to less than 3 because our very last client is going to be at index 2. And we'll use I++. And then instead of console logging I, which will just give us 0, 1, 2, we can use this I to grab items out of our appointments array. So I've gone ahead and just taken that bracket notation that we saw earlier and put that inside of my console log statement. So console log will figure out what is appointments at I, and then it will log it. And in fact, just to be really clear, let me go ahead and do this. All right, so what I've done is I've just thrown an extra argument into console log so that we'll be able to see, okay, here's the value of the index, and then here is the value of appointments at I. So let's run this loop. So the first time we go through, we see that I is set to 0, and we're able to grab client 1, who's at index 0. The second time we go through, index has been incremented because of this bit of code, and we grab our second client. And then the third time, the same thing happens. Index is now set to 2, and we are able to grab our client 3. So in this way, we are able to iterate through our clients using just this one line of code instead of, well, we do have to write out the loop, but instead of writing out this very repetitive, not very dry, not very neat thing, we can write out this sleek loop and get the same thing. So if you guys are looking closely, you might have noticed kind of a logical flaw in this. So this works fine and dandy as long as we have 3 items in the appointments array. But what if somewhere along the way we had used, say, appointments.push and put in client number 4? So now client number 4 is in argument, or it's in appointments, but it's not getting logged. And that's because of this. We have hard coded in our appointments length, which means that it's not flexible. If the appointments length changes, then this loop doesn't work anymore. And this is a really good example of why we do not like to hard code things in. But there's something we learned tonight that will help us, which is the length property. So instead of hard coding in the length of appointments, we can just do appointments.length. So now as we change the number of items in here, or we could even do appointments.pop and get rid of an item, the loop still works. It's now looping through exactly how many clients we have. So that's really nice. You will see this line of code a million times. This like I starting at 0 less than some sort of array.length, I++. This is like the magical bit of code for looping through arrays. There is one more efficient way of doing this, which is something called a for each loop, but we will get to that at a later lesson because it uses a little bit of a more complicated technique that you guys are not quite ready for. But yeah, so this is way better than logging out this. And of course, if we were to add or remove items from appointments, hard coding it in this way is definitely not going to work. So we always want to use a loop, and we always want to use the .length property to let our loop know how long to loop for, because in that way, this loop is super dynamic and it'll work regardless of how many items are in this array. So there's a little way that we can tie in our lesson last night to tonight. And then I have one more topic for you guys before we're done. And this is kind of one of those random stands on its own topics that doesn't really fit with anything else, but it is slightly related to arrays and data structures and objects that you'll see tomorrow. And that is the idea of arguments. So let me go ahead and write a function here. So I'll call it test function. And it's not going to be very interesting. We'll just have it return the number 3. So if I run test function, it returns the number 3. And one thing that you guys might have messed around with a little bit, or maybe not, is throwing in random arguments in here. So notice that up here, I don't have any parameters specified at all. Right now, this thing doesn't rely on any parameters, but I can still throw things into here. So right now, I've thrown in 3 different arguments, this number, this string, and this Boolean. And notice that test function runs perfectly fine. It's just completely ignoring them. But there is a cool way of accessing these things from within the function. So we have seen something already, which is that we could say, you know, param1, param2, param3. And if we console.logged, let's say we'll do the second one, and it appears in white over here on the console. But there's another way to access these. If instead of cherry picking each individual one, we wanted to see everything, we could use something called the arguments keyword. So there is this thing called arguments that's made available to us inside of a function. So if we instead console.log arguments, this thing appears over here on the console. And this thing is technically an object, not an array. So we'll learn more about that tomorrow. But it is an array-like object, which means that it still has this kind of order-based indexing. So if we want to access items in it, we can access them exactly as we just learned. So, so over here in the console in white, we see that that first value appears. If I grab index 1, instead we get param2. So we're able to use it in a very similar way that we've been using arrays. One word of warning is that because it is not technically an array, we can't use array methods. So you couldn't do arguments.push or pop, but you can use this bracket notation to access the arguments. So this thing is really cool because even if we have nothing up here, and no matter how many parameters we specify when we declare a function, the user might always do something crazy and just keep putting random things in here. And if we want to literally see what are all of the things, every single thing that the user put into this function, that is when you would want to use the arguments keyword. And as one final note with arguments, it is a keyword that's available within the scope of a function. So we can use it between these 2 curly brackets when we declare a function. If we tried to just use the keyword arguments out here, we would get a reference error that arguments is not defined because outside of a function, it's not defined. We saw things like console or math that are global objects. So these things do exist on a global level, but arguments does not. It is not a global object. It's not available to us unless we are inside of a function. So that's a little side note, a little kind of fun array-like item that you might get a chance to use. But in terms of that object syntax, let's run test function again. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So in terms of this arguments object that appears over here, don't worry too much about what's actually going on here. I think it'll make a lot more sense tomorrow when we cover objects. And I'll kind of mention it again tomorrow to tie everything in. Well, that is everything I have for you guys tonight. So we mostly focused on arrays, which were our first example of data structures. So we learned that you can actually store multiple pieces of information within one variable using an array. So you could put in a Boolean, a word, a string, a number, and or 3 strings or 10 strings or 564 strings. So an array is a collection of related items. And hopefully you learned some cool things you can do with arrays using indexing and the property length or the different methods such as push, pop, shift, and unshift. And finally, we saw how arrays and for loops really go hand in hand. So I will go ahead and open up the floor to questions. And we are done a little early, so please ask as many questions as you want because we have plenty of time to address them. I am not seeing any questions in the questions channel. I'll give you guys one more minute to type those, but in the meantime, I just wanted to say, hopefully you guys are feeling good about arrays, and that's why we're not getting any questions. And the homework for tonight is, of course, in the pre-course repo. You have some fun little tasks that you can do with grabbing different items from arrays. So as I showed you for the last 2 nights, you can use your terminal to run the test using npm test. The command for that, I went over the command for that last night, but let me just go ahead and do that one more time for you guys. So for tonight, it would be npm test, and then instead of JS2, we would do JS3. And in that way, you can run your tests and see how you're doing on your array homework. So I'm still not seeing any questions, so I guess we are good to go for tonight. All right, thank you guys for hanging out with me tonight, learning a little bit about arrays. Tomorrow we are going to learn about objects, which are like a even more complicated version of arrays. So it's a really cool way to store objects. And we will get a little sneak peek into some really cool ideas about what is actually going on behind the scenes in JavaScript. So objects are extremely exciting. It's one of my favorite lessons to teach. So hopefully you guys will be around tomorrow. As always, reach out if you have any questions on the homework. As I mentioned, a little challenge to you is that if you get stuck, try Googling something first. But if you're still stuck, definitely reach out. I'm sometimes available if you want to direct message me, but also go ahead and post your questions in the general channel. That's usually the best way to get the quickest response. And with that, I'll go ahead and let us end early tonight, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a great night, everyone.